I'm Kyra Shen, Chief of Planning for the City of Boston. And I want to welcome and thank you for joining Mayor Wu and the Planning Department for a discussion on the future of Faneuil Hall Marketplace. This morning's event is the kickoff of a 2-day workshop with urban design and development experts from across the US and Europe, who we have invited to Boston to help us explore how to reimagine the marketplace and how it can accelerate the ongoing transformation of the downtown from an office-centric district to a more vibrant 21st century mixed-use neighborhood. Joining us for these conversations are downtown property owners, real estate developers, urban planners, architects, thought leaders, community members, and of course, my colleagues from City Hall. I want to acknowledge the elected officials who are here with us this morning: City Councilor Coletta Zapata and State Representative Chair Michaelwitz. I also want to acknowledge Jason Berkeley and Philip Dweck from J. Safra Real Estate, who have taken recent ownership of this iconic marketplace for their partnership and stewardship with the city. We are especially grateful to the advisors from around the country and Europe who will devote the next 2 days sharing their expertise in urban design, economic development, and public-private partnerships to help us define the role and responsibility of this marketplace in a vibrant downtown. The advisors are seated here in the front of the hall, and they include Ann Gatelin Haynes from Austin and Boston, Fran Weld from Baltimore, Francine Uben of Delft in the Netherlands, James Lima and Jamie Van Klemperer, both from New York City, and Maurice Cox, now from Cambridge, but formerly of Detroit and Chicago. In this morning's session, we will outline the city's aspiration for this iconic marketplace while drawing inspiration and lessons from history. The program will include remarks from Mayor Wu, Professor Ed Glazer, Alex Krieger, and Ted Landsmark. But before I turn it over to these speakers, I want to take a few minutes to define the current challenges facing the downtown and the marketplace. Why are we launching this discussion now? This year marks the 50th anniversary of the opening of Faneuil Hall Marketplace. In 1976, this bold redevelopment of the marketplace cemented the city's turnaround from decades of decline and arrival of a new Boston. Today, we are at a critical point transitioning to a post-COVID economy, and we can once again use the marketplace as a catalyst to reimagine downtown. While Faneuil Hall Marketplace still draws tourists, it has lost its relevance and appeal for Bostonians. And after many years of control by an inattentive operator, the marketplace is now owned by JSRE, who are prepared to infuse new capital investment to reinvigorate the marketplace and work in partnership with the city to achieve the larger transformation of downtown. Let's start by taking a look at 50 years ago. The city took a big risk by choosing to preserve and redevelop the 150-year-old market buildings rather than tearing them down for more offices, incidentally. It took a visionary developer, James Rouse, an unprecedented public-private partnership with a determined mayor, Kevin White, and enthusiastic support from the business community to accomplish. It was an instant commercial success, but more importantly, it changed the narrative of the declining center city and made downtown attractive and fun again. The success of the marketplace was not a foregone conclusion after 4 decades of suburbanization and population decline. The opening of the marketplace, together with other urban renewal investments, did in fact usher 50 years of growth for Boston. Since 1980, the city's population has grown by 30% to reach over 716,000 residents. Over the same period, the city built over 80 million square feet of office space and grew its housing stock by 32%. You can see by these slides, the growth has resulted in dramatic changes in our urban fabric and skyline. The city's economy has diversified since the 1970s, shifting from a financial services-based economy to a knowledge economy that has expanded beyond the downtown. Since the late 1990s, the downtown itself has started to transition away from a strictly 9-to-5 financial district to a more mixed-use neighborhood. This transition was accelerated by development of residential projects and new open spaces along the Greenway that has resulted in a fourfold increase of the downtown's population. However, the downtown still has the highest concentration of office space and remains a critical part of the city's economy and generates over 9% of the city's tax revenues. Unfortunately, much of this positive downtown transformation was interrupted by COVID. While the city overall has regained its visitors and spending compared to pre-pandemic levels, downtown has lagged the rest of the city, with almost 10% fewer visitors and spending 15% below 2019 levels. Faneuil Hall Marketplace is an anomaly. The number of visitors is back to its pre-pandemic level, but surprisingly, they are spending 30% less than before. Other indicators also suggest that we are at a critical inflection point. Downtown office vacancies have steadily increased since 2020 to nearly 18%. Moreover, retail vacancies have accelerated in the last year to over 6%. The net result has been an alarming 20% decline in assessed commercial real estate value since 2019. Declining real estate value isn't just a concern for owners, it directly impacts the city's tax revenue and competitiveness. This problem, however, is not unique to Boston. It has affected all other major cities in the country post-COVID, so much so that Cushman and Wakefield studied 15 American cities using portfolio theory to understand the variables that impact the competitiveness and performance of real estate assets in these markets post-pandemic. The central question of the research is how cities can position and reimagine themselves to combat urban decline. One of the most interesting and important conclusions of this research is that there is a theoretical optimum real estate portfolio mix for healthy downtowns. The study determined that for downtown to maximize GDP and real estate values, the optimum balance of land uses should be 30% live, 42% work, and 26% play. Now you can see in this bar graph behind me how Boston's downtown mix of live, work, play stacks up against this theoretical optimum balance. We have way too much work and need to quadruple our live and play portfolios. Now, under Mayor Wu, we have already adopted effective policies to address our imbalance in work and live. Our office to residential conversion program will convert 14% of downtown's vacant offices to over 1,250 new homes. The city last year adopted new zoning in downtown that will incentivize high-density residential development along transit corridors. This workshop will launch our plan to address downtown's play portfolio to achieve a more optimum and dynamic mix of uses in downtown. Now, Faneuil Hall Marketplace has served as the seminal play anchor in downtown for the last 50 years. We have, once again, the opportunity to use the marketplace as a centerpiece to grow, connect, and reimagine the downtown's network of play destinations and make the city fun and relevant for locals and visitors. To achieve this, we will need new ideas, advisors, we'll need new partnerships, and then we will also need new champions. But most important, we need to be just as ambitious, imaginative, and bold as we were 50 years ago. Now, to put our current challenges in a larger historical context, I'd like to welcome Professor Ed Glazer to the podium.
Thank you, Kairos. Thank you, Mary Wu. I am deeply honored to have a chance to talk in this absolutely amazing space at this inflection point in the history of our great city. We are unquestionably facing challenges. Some of them are physical, some of them come from Washington, some of them relate to Boston's role as one of the great nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. Kairos has already alluded to the problems of vacancy, and of course, this is a ubiquitous phenomenon. This is data that comes from Castle Technology, and Castle operates security systems, so every time you key swipe into a Class A building, that you will have some chance of being part of the Castle data. This shows a massive decline of people coming into these offices since pre-COVID. And we haven't come back up. Now, these are the fanciest buildings filled with knowledge workers, but it gives you a sense of the level of challenge that our office buildings are facing, and just gives the sense of an urgent imperative to what Kairos was talking about in terms of rebalancing work and play and living. Now, in my industry, we are also facing things which weren't there 2 years ago, which is the battle with Washington. This shows the changing number of NIH grants that have gone out and shows the decline in recent years. I see little evidence that either the Senate or the House plans on cutting NIH's budget, but if the NIH doesn't actually want to make the grants, it's very hard to get NIH to make the grants. And this is billions and billions of dollars for the greater Boston economy. Next, please. And of course, I'm part of an educational institution that has a certain amount of conflict with the current administration, which some of you may have heard of. That's not going away, and that indeed is sort of an ongoing challenge that our region faces. And it shows up in funding, it shows up in visas, it shows up in all sorts of ways. When you're at war with a government, things don't necessarily go well. So, with these challenges, is it time for another reinvention? Does the city need to do what it did 50 years ago, what it did 150 years ago, what it did 350 years ago, yet again, and find a new path forward? I think the answer to that is yes. And I think we have an amazing set of leaders in our community who are poised to lead that reinvention. But at this point in time, I want to walk you through a little bit about why Boston always needs to reinvent itself and how reinventions work. So we start out as a city on the edge of on the world, more or less, with no natural comparative advantages except for cranberry bogs. Right? We've got no natural export to send back to England, and the early settlers of Boston desperately needed to buy critical inputs into their lifestyle from England, like guns and Bibles and all sorts of things that were hard to make here. And so they needed to figure out something to export. Now, the earliest settlers operated something like a colonial-era Ponzi scheme, okay, which is really appropriate since Ponzi himself was a Bostonian, okay? So how did this Ponzi scheme work? So the first settlers decided, oh, we've come here early thanks to the help of the Native Americans, we've gotten a little bit of land, we've gotten some housing, we've gotten some food. Now there are new settlers coming over. Guess what, guys? We've got stuff to sell you. So they came from England, laden with gold, laden with other forms of wealth, and in exchange for living space, exchange for food, they handed over their gold. And then the gold was used to buy the guns and the butter. And so this continues. The next round of settlers sell it to the next round and so forth. The problem, of course, with Ponzi schemes is that they require exponential growth forever, or they fall apart. And this one, like all Ponzi schemes, fell apart. It fell apart in particular in the fires of the English Civil War, which disrupted the whole thing, in part because the Puritans back in England decided, oh, we can get our paradise where we stop everyone from dancing right here in England, and we don't have to cross the ocean to impose moral rules on other people. And so they had their paradise there, and it stopped, and so Boston was lost. Right? And there began a sort of tremendous 10-year period of trying to flail around and figure out what in the world could our export industry be. Luckily, the answer came actually through a disaster. The answer came through famine. And Barbados was starving, and they sent north their ships trying to get someone who would feed them. Okay? Now, Boston didn't have any exports that were worth shipping back to England, but we had food. we had cod, we had grain, we had lots of things that would stop Barbados from starving. And so a triangular trade that sustained us for 150 years developed. This triangular trade involved Boston sending relatively low-value products south, like cod, like wood, like food. The southern colonies, which had a climate that was different from England's, right? Remember, part of our problem is our climate is very similar to that of England, so we can't do products that are exotic there. We can't do sugar, we can't do tobacco, we can't do cotton. And the southern colonies shipped out those distinct, more valuable products, and then the trade continued. This initial relatively benign trade, which was aided, of course, by the Gulf Stream, moving the ships in that triangular way, then had its awful cousin, the triangular trade that involved slavery. And we also participated in that tragically as well. But just so we understand, though, the level of what was going on, in 1770, 73% of our trade went south. It didn't go to England. Only 13% went to England. 35% of our exports are fish, 32% are livestock, and 22% are made out of wood. Okay, so this is really basic stuff, and the southern colonies are richer, but we've got a living. We're surviving by our wits, we're surviving by nimbleness, and our population rises to 7,000 in 1690 and 17,000 in 1740 when we are overtaken by Philadelphia. Okay, and so this gives you an idea of the colonial city. Now, in the 18th century, we have another crisis, okay? In this time, our crisis is based on competition from southern cities. By this, I don't mean Charleston, I mean New York, and I mean Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, that are blessed with better rivers. I mean, we love running along the Charles, but look, it's not some great Hudson thing that goes deep into the Massachusetts farmland. They have better farmland, too. And so New York and Philadelphia can take our model and make it better. And so we have this, this malaise in the mid-18th century that there are some historians claim created the grumpiness that then erupted into the American Revolution. And indeed, I'll let you to ponder that thought for yourself. But certainly, if the traders had been, if John Hancock had been more successful and he's up there in his normal day job, maybe he wouldn't have decided he wanted to be a leader in a revolution in 1775. But after 1783, we reinvented ourselves yet again. And this time, what happens is the colonial era restrictions on trade, the sort of thing that John Hancock was arguing about, disappear, meaning that the world becomes our stage. And the technology of shipping changes. The ships go from being 300 tons to 800 tons to 3,000 tons, which means we can ply the whole world, whether or not we're trading opium in China or we're looking for whales somewhere outside of Japan. And I reread Moby Dick just to prepare for this lecture. So just to remind myself of just how far those distances were. And it's an amazing triumph of human capital over distance, okay? Because the reason why Boston succeeds so well in these far-flung maritime enterprises is we've got the best sailors, we've got the best merchants, we've got nimble people who are good at finding new opportunity and opening up the world to our trade. And this is sort of an amazing epoch. And it's built very much around sail, right? It's not yet built around steam, and that sail enables us to thrive. It's the dominance of sail in Boston that also explains our unique sort of ethnic battle, right? Our unique ethnic makeup, which is the potato famine occurs in the 1840s, which is the last period in which sail is eminent, right? Sail is dominant. And so if you're escaping famine in Ireland, trying to come to the Americas, you naturally end up in Boston because we are the sail capital. By 1880, if you were, let's say, fleeing a pogrom in Poland, you would be much more likely just to come to New York. And so the later waves of immigration were much less likely to come to Boston than that wave that still occurred during the era of sail. But we reinvent ourselves again. And for this, I want to just throw out two words that I think are useful for thinking about how technologies shape cities. Centripetal, these are technologies that bring us together, and centrifugal technologies. The 19th century was a centripetal age. It was an age in which rail enabled great amounts of mobility, but rail is a hub and spoke technology, and so if you were that hub, you benefit from that. It's the era of the skyscraper, right? This amazing combination of a steel or cast iron frame and a safety elevator that enables cities to score up. And above all, it's the era of the steam engine, which enables factories to be liberated from their rivers. Think about the Lowell mills on the Merrimack to come into cities. And you can see this is the steam engines that broke our hold on sail, and then we reinvented ourselves. And so the great age of steam killed off Boston's sail-specific human capital, but we boomed. We boomed because of these engines. We boomed because of places like, this shows the Chadwick Lead Works, which you can still go visit, a beautiful old building. And in some sense, it symbolizes the move in of the lead industry from that older model, which was more suburban. That's actually in Roxbury to central Boston. And you can see the rail network that is really anchoring our city during this time period. And every one of America's old cold cities boomed during this period from 1850 to 1920, right? An amazing period of urban growth. Immigration continued to help it. Industrialization was tremendous. And then, of course, the centrifugal 20th century hit us, okay? Again, this is the 10 largest cities in the US. This is what happened to their populations between 1950 and 2020. You will see out of these, only 2 gained population during a 70-year time period. And what happened is there are a variety of different technologies, above all the automobile, right? Every new highway that cut into an urban core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. But also container ships, also cheaper trucking. All of these things made it possible for manufacturing to leave the old cities that had been anchored by transportation technology to move to places where wages were lower. They moved to right-to-work states in the South. They moved across the ocean to places where labor was cheaper. And it really felt 50 years ago, the last time this space was reinvented, that Boston's whole future was in doubt, that this was a industrial city that was headed for the trash heap of history. Famously, one of my predecessors, and alleged urban expert in Cambridge, declared that unless the federal government stepped in to try to resurrect the candy industry that was so important in East Cambridge, there's no way that East Cambridge could ever come back, right? Necco is the once and future anchor for Cambridge. But of course, it didn't work out that way. Boston reinvented itself. It reinvented itself again around ideas. So these are 2 people who are architects of the science revolution. This is James Conant, president of Harvard, a chemist, and this is Vannevar Bush, founder of Raytheon, number 2 person at MIT, and really the architect of America's post-war science strategy. This was a strategy which actually won World War II, and it's a strategy that was vital for American growth after World War II. And it was a model in which massive amounts of federal spending was then administered by universities to create new ideas, to create technology that changed everything, right? This became an anchor for our whole sort of rebirth as a capital of the information age, a place in which ideas became once again central to our economic model, and the city came back. It's not surprising that we were able to ride it, because human capital is the bedrock on individual, urban, and national success. This shows the relationship between share of the population with a college degree and per capita productivity. Okay? As the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your earnings also go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. This is something economists call human capital externalities, and it's the well-known fact that we become smart by being around other smart people. This is what makes Boston special. This is what makes this room special, that I'm surrounded by really smart and interesting people, and all of us have much to learn from one another, right? That ability of the same proximity that once got hogsheads onto clipper ships to enable people to work together, to learn from one another, to riff off each other. I mean, our greatest talent as a species is our ability to be intellectual magpies and to steal ideas from the people around us. And that fundamental power of urban density, of education, of knowledge, is what enabled Boston to resurge over the last 50 years. Now, I want to take 5 lessons away from this history before making just a couple of final remarks. 1, we're not guaranteed anything. Okay, we can never take success for granted. We're Boston. We don't have great fracking fortunes under our feet. We don't have an amazing farmland outside. We've just got ourselves, and we've got the ability to be smart, and we have to sort of live by that. 2, human capital. Whether or not that human capital is in biotech or clipper ships, that determines our victory, right? And so that means we have to be very focused on both attracting and retaining talent. 3, entrepreneurship is crucial. I can't think of, when you think about human capital, like some of it is the stuff that we manufacture in educational institutions, but much more of it is the stuff you learn from people around you. And I can't think of a talent that is more important for the long-run resilience of a city than the ability and inclination to be an entrepreneur, to start new businesses, to find a future. 60 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. He argued that this was a legacy of New York's specialization in the garment trade, which was an industry with no barriers to entry, few economies of scale, and it was a mother of entrepreneurship in which people would start sewing clothes and then they would go on to found movie studios or build skyscrapers, right? This type of entrepreneurial human capital is the stuff of which urban reinvention is made. Attracting smart people is not easy, right? So even if I take a mantra, which is attract and train smart people and then get out of their way, that doesn't mean anything about limited government, right? Because attracting smart people requires us vitally to have safe streets, fun streets, right? A well-functioning government, a well-functioning urban space. Everything that we're here to talk about is about that fundamental type of how do we retain human capital in this city and then empower it to make a better future for itself and for everyone. Requires city governments to deliver good schools, safe streets, swift commutes, and shared spaces like this one are part of what brings people to Boston. Right? You know something's a great urban asset if millions and millions of tourists come to it. And that's what we see around us. And finally, I just want to highlight, we cannot afford to waste any talent. We are not in a regime in which we have human capital abundance. Every child in Boston is an opportunity for greatness, right? And every place that you see sort of an underperforming school is an opportunity where you need to make things better. And so a critical part of this agenda has to be an inclusive agenda in which we actually make sure that everyone has an opportunity to start their own company, whatever that would be. So 2 final observations. The play part of it. During COVID, when things opened up again, there were lots of people my age, not me, but lots of other people my age who thought, great, I don't ever want to do my commute again. This is terrific, I'm just going to work from home, I don't need to learn anything new, I don't need to do anything. But every 19-year-old, every 20-year-old in my world was desperate to get back to living again, desperate to get back and being close to people again. And that's why the consumer city, the part of the city that's about being a playground, is so vital, because this is the part that can reactivate urban spaces. This is fundamentally what will distinguish 21st century cities, is the ability for them to bring people together and find joy with one another, which has always been a tremendous urban asset. Just think about Socrates and Plato bickering on an Athenian street corner, but it's become actually more important than ever. And this space is part of that magic. One minor point about face-to-face contact and learning. So there's been a number of papers looking at what happens when you send people remotely. Nick Bloom's work 12 years ago, the work of Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington. Both papers look at call center workers, and both papers find the same basic facts. One of which is, you send call center workers, they can still make as many calls, right? That should not shock you. But when you send people remotely, their probability of being promoted drops by more than 50%, right? 50%. And so any young person who thinks they want to live remotely is making a huge mistake, because by being remote, you don't learn from people around you. Like, being a call center worker means you get promoted if you're known to be able to handle the difficult jobs. Well, how would you learn how to do that if you never came into the office? How would your boss learn you were good at doing that if you weren't in the office? Being remote turns off the learning channel that's so crucial to what we are as human beings and what we can potentially do. So I often say that cities rest on a 3-legged stool. One part of that is the magic of social interactions. And I'm using the old market in Jerusalem to try to capture that. It's the fact that we buy, we sell, we laugh, we learn, we connect with one another physically in urban spaces. And in some sense, it's responsible for the magical things, the collaborative chains of creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits for thousands and thousands of years. The bottom line, and this is from the Boston's marathon bombing, is government needs to battle the demons of density. There are these downsides: crime, traffic congestion, contagious disease that occur when people live close to one another, right? Fighting against that is a huge part of what governments need to do in cities. But of course, finally, there's the physical city. As a social scientist, I never tire of reminding people that the real city is made of flesh and blood, not glass and concrete. Cities ultimately are their human essence, not their physical essence. But let's face it, the buildings also matter, right? And if we do not cherish our buildings, we do not figure out how the human interacts with the steel, the concrete, the brick, we will be letting our city down. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of this conversation about how this incredible urban space that has played such a role in past reinventions and in past miracles that have come out of this city can be used again for the 21st century. Again, thank you for including me in this event.
Thank you, Professor Glazer. If I had taken your class, I wouldn't have become an urban planner. So Boston could have dodged a bullet. Now, one of the things that you mentioned 5 lessons, and I think I was surprised to not see a 6, which is about leadership. And I think that these things don't happen without leadership. And I want to welcome Mayor Wu to the podium so her leadership can lead us to this next reinvention, and she can share her aspirations for this new marketplace. Mayor Wu.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Well, Kairos didn't take Ed's class, but I did. So we very well may have ended up with Mayor Shen if things had gone a different way. I'm grateful to everyone for the time that you've taken, not just to be with us this morning, but the time you've taken to show up for our city time and again. As always, I treasure Professor Glazer's mentorship and friendship, and even now, I won't even try to count how many years later after Ec 1011A, I still get a stirring of fear of, am I going to get called on next? And now I have. So thank you for all of your insights, and thank you to each and every one of our experts and friends and visitors. Kairos was charged with my desire to help us think big as a city and to go to, in both ways, to the people who know our city best because they're living it day to day, and the big thinkers who can bring a fresh perspective and who also have that mix of both. So our local big thinkers, those with big perspective who also know our city very well because you've been involved in so many ways with Boston's built environment and our people. Thank you. And to Professor Krieger and to Professor Landsmark, thank you for your words that we're about to hear, your incredible stewardship of our city, and congratulations and thank you again, especially to Dr. Landsmark for your service to our planning board and so much that you've done for our city over many, many decades and generations. I also want to thank my colleagues in elected office for being here, my friend, City Councilor Gigi Coletta Zapata, and soon to be baby Coletta Zapata. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all your care for our waterfront, for our communities, and trying to figure out how we manage this moment in the way that brings everyone into the conversation. Always treasure your leadership. Thank you so much to Representative Aaron Michaelwitz for your stewardship of our entire Commonwealth, but especially your care for your district and how our economy needs to be worked into that. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an overview, and then I think we have some time for more specific back and forth, which I always enjoy much more, and then to hear from our real experts in a bit. But I want to pick up with the sense of buildings and people and how who we are and how we're connected to each other is most important, but is always facilitated by the spaces that we end up creating. So you are sitting in the very seats that many have sat in before, whether it is tourists from around the world who come to study American democracy and its very roots, whether it is new, soon-to-be American citizens who are coming for their citizenship oath ceremonies and swearing that oath to the United States of America, or whether it is brand new, soon-to-be baby lawyers who are sworn in as members of the bar in this sacred space for our democracy as well. If you breathe the very air here in Faneuil Hall, you are connected with the conversations, the debates, the back and forth that has shaped who we are, and that has come directly from Bostonians' unwillingness to back down when someone else from outside, far away from our community, tries to tell us what to do, how to take care of each other, how to run our economy, how to cancel our grant, not that part, but everything else. We have been here before, and this very space has stewarded so many of the difficult and deep conversations that have shaped who we are. And so it is the perfect place to be thinking about what Boston's reinvention means in this moment as well, who we are and where we're headed in the future. You have already been introduced to Jim Rouse and his sense of ingenuity and deep belief in the American city overall at a time when it felt like not many others believed in cities, in the disillusionment of the Cold War, Vietnam War, national cleavages that were deeply exposed through the civil rights movement and the determination of so many in our country to build better despite intense opposition. Rouse understood that cities, in fact, rely on a fundamental bedrock truth. They give people purpose by being connected to each other. When we live in a city, we're connected to our community members across all those differences, and we have to find a way in building our daily lives to determine that common ground. And we're also connected to the people who have come before us. Boston especially is a place where you cannot go about a daily commute or walk around town without being confronted with the scale of history that has occurred here. The red bricks on the ground, the ornate decorations on some of our buildings, or the plaques and memorials that we're striving to ever expand the stories of who's been here and what they have done. But Rouse believed that not only were American cities great, but that Boston could lead the comeback of the great American cities. And he believed that Faneuil Hall, the cradle of liberty, could be that catalyst. But here's what you might not know about what happened when his crews got to work. As they tore into the interior of Quincy Market, they gutted the building to its bones. But when they reached the center of the main hall, a worker punched through a ceiling on the second floor and found something a great deal more impressive than just the cobwebs they were expecting. It turned out to be a false ceiling that had been hidden for decades behind plaster and steel trusses, and it was disguising one of the great architectural treasures of American design, that ornate interior of a soaring rotunda, the only elliptical Delorme dome in the United States. 3 layers of pine planks laminated into 77 arches on the outer ring, 48 on the inner, all laced together with timber bracing. It was a marvel that had been handcrafted by one of Boston's finest lighthouse architects, and it had been just collecting dust above 2 floors of warehouses and wholesalers for half a century. So Rouse tore down that ceiling, cut a hole in the second floor, and now the whole world has been able to benefit from and enjoy that remarkable work of Yankee ingenuity. Within just a few years from that action, Faneuil Hall Marketplace was drawing more than 14 million visitors annually, becoming one of the most visited places in the country. And that festival marketplace that was pioneered here was replicated in city after city. Boston used what we already had, a rotunda hidden behind a false ceiling, a building carrying the weight of our history, and reinvented the future. So what's above our ceiling now? Every time Boston has answered that question, as Professor Glazer just showed us, the results have been remarkable. Before Quincy Market reopened, there was only one outdoor cafe in the entire city on Newbury Street. The architect who redesigned Quincy Market was told that people in Boston simply didn't like to eat outside. I'm not going to get into outdoor dining more. Today, we're hearing a new set of doubts. Remote work has taken over, the office is dead, nobody's going to spend meaningful time downtown. And in one sense, the skeptics are right. Everything is different, and we need to rethink our mix of work, play, and live. A downtown built entirely around office use will not meet the needs of the next generation. But that conclusion drawn, that downtown is finished and we have to move on, is just as wrong as the idea that we don't like the outdoors. Boston is America's first city, the birthplace of democracy, the hub of innovation, and I will add, the city of champions. And so we're not going to go down without a big fight for being the best of the best. At a time when cities are under attack from Washington, Boston chooses to believe in the great American city. And we believe in downtown too, because we understand that for 396 years, our city, has had the ability to reinvent ourselves, pulling this country forward along with us. And we need to find ourselves in this moment ready to push forward. Faneuil Hall Marketplace, this space, downtown, our commercial corridors across the city, we have the potential to anchor the best comeback in America and to anchor it here for the second time. Now, getting there means looking at what we've been walking underneath and asking what's really up there. Because the ceiling in Quincy Market wasn't the last ceiling Boston tore down. Starting in the 90s, recognizing the value of our natural geography, state and city leaders worked together to take down a highway that cut downtown Boston off from our own waterfront and bury it underground. It was controversial, it took too long, Lord knows it caused a lot of traffic, and I think a lot of folks in this room still have the memories, maybe a little PTSD from that big project. But it was the right decision. And the Rose Kennedy Greenway and the tunnels underneath stand as proof today of what that kind of long-term thinking and that bold determination can deliver. We still have more work to do to achieve our goal of a cohesive mixed-use urban center. We've removed the ceiling that was a highway, but we haven't fully stitched together what was opened up. The connections between downtown, the Greenway, and the waterfront remain incomplete. And these extraordinary assets all around us, this hall, the old State House, the old South Meeting House, and our neighborhoods around, too often can function as distinct and separated tourist destinations rather than part of a cohesive living district. We're not too far off from such a district. If you think about it, Faneuil Hall Marketplace is a hub of the wheel, the Greenway, City Hall Plaza, soon to be FIFA Fan Fest, Freedom Trail as a spokes connecting Beacon Hill, Bullfinch Triangle, West End, the Garden, the Theater District, the Common, Chinatown, North End, and the waterfront. A downtown that looks more like the rest of our neighborhoods, resilient, connected, diversified, full of people at all hours, and a place that doesn't empty out the moment the clock hits 5. So what's above the ceiling? Over the last 4 years, we launched one of the most ambitious office-to-residential conversion efforts in the country. And that 1.5 million square feet of underutilized commercial space will be more than 1,700 new homes, almost all of them downtown. Transit ridership is recovering. Foot traffic is increasing. For 6 consecutive quarters, office vacancies downtown have decreased. And there are many, many, many folks in this room who have been behind each and every one of those stats. Whether you are David Greeny and one of the property owners who is doubling down and believing in what could come, or one of our thought leaders and partners, the architects, the visionaries, the neighborhood leaders who continue every day to do the work, brick by brick, sidewalk by sidewalk, of making sure the city is the most beautiful and welcoming it could be. The next step is making sure that residents, all those new residents and all of our residents now, have a reason to stay, to enjoy downtown after work, on weekends, in every season. For too many locals, Faneuil Hall Marketplace has become nothing more than a place they occasionally take out-of-town visitors. It's not yet a place that captures all of Boston. You can't find fresh apples or cranberries here, chimi or mofongo, banh mi or cachupa. I would normally say that it can feel a little bit like walking through an airport or a mall, but I've been at Logan Airport and seen now they have the Boston Public Market actually featuring all of those local things at our airport. And so even our airport, Logan Airport, has done a fantastic job of making sure that connection to the city is vibrant and growing. We need to tap into the same spirit of the 1970s and recognize that what we're building from is, of course, light years and decades of improvement, no longer vacant and decrepit and crumbling location here, but one that still has so much potential and possibility. So, we're working to create pathways for local businesses to succeed here, rethinking spaces that are currently too large, too expensive, or too rigid, working with partners to break them into smaller, more flexible footprints that can lower the barrier to entry, providing incentives and resources to close those gaps on the balance sheets. We've provided support for local entrepreneurs through programs like our Space Grant, encouraging every resident with an idea for our neighborhoods to not just do that at home, in your home neighborhood, but connect that to downtown in our high foot traffic areas. We also need to situate Faneuil Hall Marketplace as a centerpiece of a larger focus on building a stronger nightlife downtown. Through our Office of Nightlife Economy, we've launched a late night food truck program, piloted social districts that allow people to come together and enjoy public space in new ways, and invested in public art and programming that has already drawn hundreds of thousands of people downtown. And thank you to Mike Nichols and our downtown bid and the Greenway for partnering so much on expanding those opportunities. With help from our state legislature and city council, we've expanded access to liquor licenses in unprecedented ways, making it easier for businesses to grow and provide space for residents to gather. And we've continued to make progress on permitting so businesses can open and expand without headaches and with the full support of their city. Our job now is to build on that momentum so downtown is active and welcoming not only during business hours, but throughout the evening across all seasons. In the 1760s, angered by the injustice of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, colonists gathered right here to declare that the circumstances of your birth should not determine your access to dignity and freedom. Several months ago, federal agents challenged those priorities, promises that were forged on this very floor. They stood on the steps of this building and told residents of our city they could not come inside to become Americans here. Not because of the content of their character or the history of their actions, but because the president didn't like where they were born. Boston can be the antidote to so much that is happening right now. The vision we're setting out for our city and here at Faneuil Hall Marketplace, a place filled with the food and goods and the businesses of every neighborhood in the city, every culture that represents Boston, a place that belongs to all of Bostonians. This is the same work as standing up for the ideas vigorously defended 2.5 centuries ago right here in this very space. This is a chance to once again show Boston and this country at our best, a beacon of possibility. So let's make everyone feel at home. Let's build a Faneuil Hall Marketplace and a downtown that's not just a front door to Boston, not just a front door to our country, but a front door to our future, and a city that is always on the forefront of invention, reinvention, and innovation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Mayor. The Mayor and Professor Glazer is going to take some questions. So for those of you who are interested in interrogating the history of our reinvention, and also the kind of leadership and aspiration that the Mayor sees is necessary for our continued transformation, I think Rebecca will have a microphone.
Hi, my name is Susan Luongo, and I've been at Faneuil Hall Marketplace for the past 45 years, initially as an employee and eventually as a vendor. Over that time, I've seen this marketplace through many challenges, the big dig, the pandemic, and the natural ups and downs that come with being part of a historic public place. Through all of it, the small micro businesses have remained the constant backbone of Faneuil Hall. We are the ones who have stayed, even as every major chain brought in over the years has struggled to survive here. I will probably face some backlash for what I am going to say, but I feel it needs to be said, and we as vendors can no longer continue to stay silent. Professor Glazer earlier suggested that the current administration is partly responsible for lack of marketing and investment in this property. I appreciate the perspective, believe me, I do. But I also want to note that the decline in visibility, foot traffic, and promotional support began long before this administration. With that in mind, I'd like to better understand what prevented consistent marketing and vendor support in those earlier years, and why a long-term strategy wasn't put in place to strengthen the marketplace and protect it from the decline we've all been experiencing. I also want to acknowledge that the last strong ally vendors had was Mayor Menino. Since his time, vendors' voices have not been consistently included in planning or decision-making, despite our long-term commitment to this marketplace. Finally, I'd like to raise a concern about communication. Vendors were not informed at all that this meeting was taking place today. The only reason that two of us are here today is because we happened to see it announced on the news. Going forward, how can communication be improved so that all vendors are notified and included in discussions that directly affect our businesses? Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for being here, and thank you. Who's the other vendor who's here? Nice to see you both. Thank you so much for being here, and I apologize for the invitation or information about this meeting not being shared directly with the vendors. We have a long runway, I think, to think about, from what we are trying to do with downtown as a whole, to Faneuil Hall Marketplace, to the operations of the individual spaces within Faneuil Hall and all of that. So while this meeting wasn't intended to be focused on the sort of day-to-day of what's happening within the marketplace, you're absolutely right that you should have been part of every level of that conversation, and we'll make sure that happens moving forward. I will say, current administration, previous administration, communication, marketing, et cetera, this has been a shared sense of need from the city as well, which is why we're here today. That the arrangement here, given the extraordinary level of need back in the 1970s, there was a trade-off that was made. And it's one that, thankfully, in many places, we don't have to make the same kind of trade-off today to basically hand over full operating rights and management of public-owned properties in order to have the capital investment to happen. We're doing many public-private partnerships still on terms that I think preserve much more of the city's ability to be the direct oversight agent and direct operator of many of the details. But in this case, the arrangement was made so that although the city still owns technically the Boston Redevelopment Authority still owns the underlying property, the building, the management, the choices around who is vending here, how they're communicated with, how those relationships are managed, those are all done outside of the city. That is something that I have always felt if we could go back in time, I'd love to adjust some provisions of that lease. But again, understanding how few options it felt like our predecessors had at this time, this is a situation that we have. And we want to be a stronger partner at the city, even though there might not be the direct legal ability to do so. We have found more of a working partnership and openness to doing that with the new current managers of the market. And so that's another reason why we're here today, and they're in the room. We're very thankful that they're in the room to hear directly about the big picture that we're talking about, and also the day-to-day that we really need to get right. That's what our visitors and residents and all the Boston residents that you employ experience every day. So I appreciate you being here.
Miss Professor Glazer, you may have to call on people.
Well, I'll just take this opportunity to make a comment about my response to the mayor's speech, which, however many years ago it was. It was always obvious that she was very smart. What's been so amazing is just seeing her emerge as a leader who's able to sort of broadcast both courage and humanity. And like you said some nice things about me, but I cannot tell you how proud I am to have played any role whatsoever in the making of your leadership for the city.
I need to say one thing that actually connects to both what Susan said in a very tangential way, and another back to my Harvard days. So I think we might talk a little bit more about this later, but my first experience at Faneuil Hall was coming when I was visiting for deciding where to go to college. And of course, this was a big stop. I had my clam chowder in a bread bowl, and I enjoyed and loved every bit of it. And then I went to Harvard and on campus and was told that every day in Annenberg there would be ice cream and clam chowder. And then I was sold.
Hello. That's a little loud. Good morning. My name is Patrick Snyder. My question is largely about the interaction of Faneuil Hall Marketplace with other nodes downtown as well that definitely become very lively on the weekends and in the summer, like Seaport, the North End, Back Bay, Newbury Street. I'm curious how you see the revitalization of Faneuil Hall Marketplace interacting with those other nodes, not even just on the weekends, but also for day-to-day basis, and creating more of a 24/7 Boston that's maybe not a 24/7, 24 hours. We all like to have our sleep, but that daily interaction throughout the city. Thank you.
Well, even as we were going through some of the presentations here on the data and the charts and numbers, I was thinking in my head, we really have to be precise, because when we say downtown in Boston, and today, I think we're specifically talking about the financial district and this area. But in fact, when you compare Boston to other cities and you say downtown, wherever it is, we basically have three downtowns. We have the Seaport, we have Back Bay, and we have this area. And thinking through what connects each one of them, what literally connects them, right? How we can continue improving the reliability and accessibility of our transit system so that everyone can get around, the multimodal investments that need to happen. We'll see that tested and shown off this summer, especially when we have in a positive way, a crush of visitors and foot traffic here for all of the tall ships, World Cup, 250th anniversary. That will really show. It's pushing us right now to think through what we need to do to make the logistics of that possible. And then there's as people are stitching together what they need to do for their daily lives, how do they make live and work possible and play across all of these areas smoothly and seamlessly, including to our neighborhoods. And then does each one offer a different specialty? And we're seeing that emerge, right, with the Seaport as a unique district in its own way, maybe started off as conceived of as the innovation district, as the sort of main place that life sciences and some of the Kendall Square energy could come across the river as well, but has certainly evolved into a thriving retail district alongside all of the commercial spaces there, and we're building up the residential side. In Back Bay, I think we're seeing now many of some of the financial services and other tenants shifting in that direction, doubling down on what Boston could be, including many of the tech companies now, Whoop, over on that side of the city, and others who are gathering there. Boston Properties obviously anchoring that for a very long time and really thinking through how to offer the best of the best in terms of Class A plus office space. And then that leaves this area of how do we think through continuing to preserve the commercial energy, but give more of the draw to be here. A lot of that will be adjusting the residential component of it and doing whatever we can to continue building, and then giving people the interests and the attraction to be able to want to come downtown in person and stay here with the events and with the unique flavors that we can offer for history and innovation and arts and culture. Every time you come to this section of the city, there should be something new and unexpected that you get to experience. And I think that's some of the flexibility that these spaces in particular, City Hall Plaza, the Common, the Greenway, Faneuil Hall, can offer in terms of being the real conveners of the city.
One of the great assets of Boston is just its sheer density level. None of these places, none of these three downtowns are that far apart. You can relatively easily walk from them. And, when you think about great cities, they're really archipelagos of connected neighborhoods. They're places where, you can get from one place to the other. You can sometimes see from one place to another. And when I think about sort of you talking about public art, I think about one of those functions is making the pathways that connect to these spaces more beautiful, more functional, more usable. I want to just take, this is a pet hobby horse of mine, but one of the things that I sort of have disliked in sort of the fads of planning over the last 5 years has been the emphasis on 15-minute cities, as if sort of what we wanted to do was focus on each neighborhood in isolation, right? That's the last thing we want. We want to think about a city that is just shot full of different ways of linking different areas. And I think that's really the vision that I've heard from you, and that's I think the right way to think about these multiple downtowns.
Good morning. Reverend Dr. Kevin Peterson. Pleased to see you again, Mayor Wu. Pleased to meet you, Professor Glazer. My question is simple. Mayor Wu, does it bother you at all, does it concern you at all, that this place is named after a slave owner, a slave trader? Does that bother you, and will you make moves to changing the name of Faneuil Hall?
It's nice to see you. I appreciate you being here, and I'm thankful for the advocacy that you've had over the city in many, many years to ensure that we're constantly striving to be the best version of ourselves. And I appreciate your advocacy related to this particular building too, to highlight and, as you have said to me directly, both in the meetings that we've had privately and also in the public conversations that we've had, that the push to think about the name of this building isn't, even from your perspective, just about a name, right? Every name matters, and every memorial and every monument that we have in the city matters. And we've been doing a lot of work through the Unmonumented Project and through many other partnerships to ensure that as we approach the 250th very soon, and as we approach the city's 400th in 2030, that we are doing a much better job of representing the fullness of those stories. But we've had conversations about how the name of this building, in your eyes as well, is really about a larger conversation on racial justice and a larger conversation on how we as a city live the values that were described in this space. And so I've thought a lot about this particular building and this name, right? It is named in the documents dating back 300, now hundreds of years back, and that name and that name change would be difficult to, I think, have the fullest conversation about who we are as a city. We have put a lot of efforts into making sure that we are doing the research. We're showing what we have learned. There was a large exhibit here that came from a significant amount of research that I know you were part of and saw, that showcased the lives and the stories of those enslaved community members who were part of this building and the construction and the building of it, and related to Peter Faneuil. So at this moment, I do not support a name change, but really appreciate the conversation and the need that we need to have citywide to talk about the full context of how we are continuing to be the Boston that was envisioned but never yet actually realized. There are many things in our society morally, especially when we look back at our history, that are problematic. And it's, the many of the names that we hold up as a country, from General George Washington, who we just celebrated as almost an honorary Bostonian because of the closeness of what he meant to the city, with Evacuation Day being just a couple of days ago, and the 250th anniversary of expelling the British from Boston. There is a medal that is at the Boston Public Library that commemorates his bravery. And of course, Washington Street and many names throughout our country's history are also connected to very Reverend Peterson, I'd love to talk with you separately about this, but maybe yeah. I'll let you have one last comment, and then we need to move on. Thank you. Absolutely not. Thank you for being here.
We have one more question over here, and then we'll wrap.
Good morning. My name is Mary Gay Griswin. I'm a resident in the Bulfinch Triangle area of the West End, and I am a board member of the Friends of Christopher Columbus Park. I am very, very excited to be part of this conversation and to know of this initiative. Thank you, brilliant, for getting it going. As I looked at the slide that Professor Glasser presented on the work, play, stay, live, it struck me that the goal should be moving that work column to the live column. And my question is regarding the great traction that the housing conversion program is starting to gain. Who is the target audience for those new housing units that are being opened up in downtown? Are we deliberately trying to attract the people who already work here to start to live here, and then they will play here all together? Or are we just putting, making spaces and not trying to influence who will be living in those spaces, what they will need when they live here in order to make that graph more balanced in the way that we need it to be?
So that's a great comment, and I think it's something that hopefully this conversation will be all about. But if you think about our problem with office is dwarfed by the problem in Chicago or the problem in New York, places that sort of built enormous stretches of office space that were sort of completely separated from the other things that happen in the city. And it's clear that while that was very functional in 1978, right, it's not at all what people seem to want in a post-COVID world. And the more we have an interspersed world in which living and playing and working go together in a sort of dizzying mosaic of urban spaces, the healthier our urban spaces will be, partially because it's very different to think about, am I going to go to work, when that just means rolling out of bed, going downstairs and walking 3 blocks, versus am I going to go on a multimodal marathon of an hour and 15 minutes to get to work, right? It feels totally different on that. That being said, there's also a lot to like with a little bit of separation between where you live and where you work. And so I think a vision that says, let's get this right for all 3 things is right. But I don't think there should be a view that you only want people to live exactly where they work. I think we want a city in which people are vibrantly moving through the city all the time and meeting new people and connecting with new people. And that sort of is what makes a city that is sort of successful, inclusive, and dynamic.
I will just add 2 points to that. One, that because everything is so fluid and flexible these days, and people can make choices about where they work relative to where they live in all new ways that are untethered to any need for geographical proximity, we have to give people as many options as possible. And there will be people who end up living in some of these new units and are still zooming in to work in a different city or even a different country potentially. And there will be people who move in because they want to stop zooming and want to start rolling out of bed and going downstairs. So I think because the chicken and egg now it's a different relationship between live and work, we have to just create as much housing as we can in every part of the city. And my second point was we need to be specific about it. So I hope you know the incredible genius that is a couple seats next to you, which is our Chief of Housing, Sheila Dillon, who is the country's leading Chief of Housing, and very grateful that Sheila and her team have been working with us to really start to get specific, not only about the number of units that we need, but what kind of units. Because although, to some extent, right, the charts and the supply and demand is one thing, but senior housing and where we need that, housing that is permitted for multiple larger number of units so that families have more options, families with kids have more options, units that are affordable, that are included as well, so that we're not only having districts created in the city that are market rate and therefore more expensive and out of reach for our families, that there's a foothold in every part of the city, even as we're connecting the whole city for every slice of our community.
So thank you, Mayor Wu and Professor Glazer. We're going to take a short break, and the mayor's going to stay for the second half, where we'll focus more of our conversation on the actual physical planning history of this marketplace and put it into a planning context. So with that, I want to thank Professor Glazer for coming. I know you're actually going to a thesis defense, so we will miss you, but thank you again for spending time for us. Thank you very much. I want to invite Professor Alex Krieger to give a history of the planning context and discussions that we've had as a city around this marketplace and around this district. Just as a matter of tidbit, Professor Krieger was appointed at Harvard in 1977. So his tenure at the university is almost exactly the same length as the age of this wonderful, iconic marketplace. Now, I think that gives you a particular perspective. I hope that this, after your discussion, will bring the mayor back up with Professor Ted Landsmark, where we'll actually have a discussion about the significance and meaning of this marketplace. Professor Krieger.
Thank you. I'm a little bit less agile than my friend Ed. And instead of doing all this, I'm going to stare at the screen here and then point to you to switch it. But of course, it now died. So, sorry. Okay. All right, so I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Professor Glazer said, but from a designer planner standpoint as opposed to from an economist standpoint. And I believe that Kairos asked me to talk a little bit, sort of place ourselves on the place, in the place, around the time of the market being opening. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So this was a very auspicious year in Boston's history, not only because that's when I arrived, but by the way, it was part of it. Notice we were already celebrating the bicentennial for at least 3 years. This little event, you can see it's the People's Bicentennial Commission, not the cities or the Commonwealths. And even if you didn't know when the Tea Party celebration was, you could probably date this because of all the Impeach Nixon signs there up in the background there, right? And indeed, the marketplace opened to immediate acclaim, not just locally, but around the country, in fact, around the world. We were besieged by tourists. Actually, that had been building for several years in anticipation of the bicentennial, of course. We had very distinguished visitors, including, of course, the Queen herself and the Prince, somehow celebrating our 200th secession from the British Crown. And I showed the Hancock Building for a particular reason, which will be apparent a little bit later on, because 76 also happened to be when it was first occupied after about 5 or 6 years of replacing glass and other such. But that's not the reason I'm showing it to you. Actually, at the time, the Hancock Corporation was very supportive of the planning at the time that led to this, as I'll show in a second. Okay, so for those people who were my age back in 1976, who spent more than half of their lives in a city that was declining, both in terms of its economy as well as its population, for sure. 76 was about the time when those folks could kind of start to believe, maybe, that this sort of long decline was truly behind us, and that sort of better days were ahead. And I'm not exaggerating this. Really, from the beginning of the Depression, actually, into the 1970s, Boston was not doing so well, despite Ed's remarks about how we reinvented ourselves. So to prove this to you, I actually have to go back a decade or two, if I may, just for a minute, right? So look at this headline from the Boston Globe. A hapless backwater tumble down has been among cities. Isn't that an amazing comment about a city, right? Or actually, Mayor Collins was actually quite quotable. I'm going to quote him several times. During the early parts of his administration, saying, a malaise of the spirit. It reminds you of President Carter, by the way, right? We had a malaise of our spirit. And also, you see, we were all kind of ashamed of our city. Kind of amazing. And by the way, just to kind of dig in a little bit further, because Ed exaggerated the recovery a little bit, in the one decade between the 50s and the 60s, in that one decade, Boston lost over 100, actually I have this magical thing, over 100,000 people. Think about that. Think about that, right, in one decade. And that it didn't stop then. We continued to lose people for 3 more decades, to the point where almost 250,000 people left Boston by the 1980s. Actually, in the 70s, it had something also to do with what hasn't been mentioned yet today, the kind of the crisis around busing and desegregation of public schools. So Boston was not in a very happy place for a long time, for quite a very long time. By the way, look at this. Every decade of the 19th century, to support what Ed said, population was expanding by double digits, sometimes 50%. Imagine 50% in one decade. Imagine what would happen today in Boston if we got to be 1.5 million before 2035 or something. So this was really an unusual period. Soon after, actually, with the start of the Depression, soon after, Boston began to decline. Before, of course, it was reinvented spectacularly. Some of you who maybe are close to my age might remember the Massachusetts Miracle, which was not happening in downtown Boston. It was happening around the perimeter. It was also called, of course, the Golden Semicircle, the promise of not only an inner belt, thankfully that didn't happen, but look, all those blue lines pointing towards the center. The central artery was the first completed portion of the inner belt. There was great applause about actually this golden semicircle, a promise of an even larger one, and of course, you see, it was the birth of 128, and all of the sort of, I guess you'd now call them grandparents of the Googles and Metas and Microsofts of the world. And I'm sure I'm leaving out. And even the New York Times was rather impressed in 1958 by calling it Boston's golden semicircle, right? Now I want to point to this chart a little bit. Some of you in the back, I'm sure cannot read it. As Boston's population was declining dramatically between 1950 and 1982, look at the increase of companies locating themselves along 128. It's kind of amazing, almost like a 1-for-1, right? Population of Boston declining because many of those folks were also moving out here. The number of companies in 57 was 100, up to 1,200 a couple of decades later. So this also represented a kind of a nationwide shift and a cultural shift regarding kind of where people wish to be as opposed to where they had been born or lived in a long, prolonged economic decline. Yes, it was mentioned, but it was initially promised with sort of great applause. Look at that, Boston gets sky roads soon. This was a very complimentary article in 1950 about this. There you see it on the construction. It took most of the decade of 50s. Most of the heavy construction took place by 1956. And by the way, there's the marketplace right there. Fortunately, it was very close to being demolished, actually, for the artery itself, right? So think about that transformation. Again, promised as a good thing, because this would allow folks to come into Boston more easily as opposed to what happened. It allowed folks to leave Boston easily. And it was the final indignity, if you will, to then displacing the marketplace from where they used to be, right there on the harbor's edge. This is an 1825 lithograph. Think about that. They belong there. Now, of course, all of our economies of the 19th century necessitated the increase of wharfs and landfills and so forth. So the Faneuil Hall was already removed from its waterfront, but indeed it wasn't green, by the way, when it happened, hardly. But there it was, right? All these buildings literally cut. Their side facades now having nice windows on them for some of them. So this was sort of happening in Boston, the impacts of which were not yet apparent, that the impacts were not going to be as great as, of course, if we go back a second, if we go back to, right, it wasn't as promising as, of course, this headline announced. Now, go forward. Okay. And we also were in the era of urban renewal. that began actually before Ed Logue, who will appear in a second, came to Boston. And look at this. This is from a '53 report. Today, almost every sort of self-respecting urbanist would reverse these two titles, right? They would say a new plan, and they would say an obsolete neighborhood. But there's in those words a new plan emerging. And the reason I show this to you, it's still there, and I think by now it warrants becoming a landmark. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, that's just a clever marketing by the folks who were running the Charles River Park. But think about it a little bit differently, actually. This was a kind of and in fact, this work here was a kind of a plea. Hey, Bostonians, don't leave. We're making new modern housing for you. Well, not exactly for those who were displaced. We're recreating the city. Please stay. That's the more sort of urgent message behind this kind of marketing plaque, which is I would support it becoming a landmark in the future, and I hope it remains there. And there's Mr. Logue, who arrives in the city in 1961, thanks to Mayor Collins. He's very quotable. So there he is again, right? Urban renewal is a pruning and a replanting. Sounds pretty good. The old comes down and the good remains. Though no one quite asked who the old were and what they were thinking about and which good should remain. And so I will focus on two urban renewal projects or initiatives that actually were very instrumental in the saving of the marketplace, even though we rarely want to say anything good about urban renewal. And it doesn't deserve much good. But in the case of Boston, actually, these two, the so-called West End was going on already, and of course, this, which people completely forgot, was the first urban renewal in the sort of housing district right along the Fort Point Channel. We're already well in progress. And in fact, if you think about the effect of urban renewal, there were ultimately 18 urban renewal districts covering almost half the city. And actually, the Back Bay was in line to become another one. And fortunately, I'm going to say this in a funny way, so forgive me. One of the good things about urban renewal is it created actually a preservation movement. Really, more or less the first time, especially in urban America, as opposed to, elsewhere. So, let's go to the one that, again, it was initiated before the arrival. Yes, before the arrival. Now I have to keep. You're now going ahead of me with that, which is the kind of the so-called downtown waterfront Faneuil Hall urban renewal area. This was extremely significant and actually fairly successful in that very few homes were displaced. There were not very many people living there, and an awful lot of prescient understanding about life and open space, living, not so much working, and having a good time, were part of this particular. And I think it would be important actually for some of our visitors to kind of look at this plan a little bit, if they can, in the next day or so, and what it achieved. The market themselves during the 1950s were in absolute decline. By the late 60s, they really were sort of empty and depleted. And while there was support for their maintenance, there was also an equal amount of calls actually for, well, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's do something better than these old obsolete buildings. And actually, it turned out. By the way, again, I'm sorry I keep showing you New York Times headlines, but look at this. Boston waterfront at 25, a model urban renewal. I don't think you would find a similar headline virtually anywhere, a model urban renewal. And think about this. This becomes, right, the preservation of historic structures and converting them into a new use, the provision of public space at waterfront's edge. What were waterfronts prior to the 20th century? They were our backyards. They are not our fun yards. They were where people worked. That was the domain of the longshoremen. So the prescient aspect of converting them into parks, the inclusion of an important cultural facility, almost virtually an eighth wonder of the world, an aquarium in which you could walk around it as opposed to stare at a little bitty in an Asian restaurant or something. Right? So this actually it not only impacted Boston, it impacted hundreds of cities around the world that then started to convert their production yards, their backyards, into their front yards by the same mechanisms: open space, living, cultural amenities. So indeed it deserves this little attribute of being a model urban plan. Now, well, back to Mr. Ed Logue. He actually said this a couple of times, quoting supposedly Joseph Stalin. I don't think he understood that this gets back to Joseph Stalin. It's actually true, right? You can't make an omelet without cracking some eggs. Unfortunately, the question is, what did the eggs think about this, right? And so again, even though the government center, while it was somehow easier to convince Americans at the time, Bostonians, that the waterfront should be somehow made more accessible, the markets were a fair distance away from the waterfront, and indeed separated by the central artery. And so that was the hardest thing for the otherwise waterfront urban renewal district to get to. And so it kind of languished for another decade or two. But it was the government-centered, or so-called the Scully Square government-centered urban renewal plan that actually wind up, not by its own intention, but inadvertently wind up being a way in which the markets came to life again. I don't mean to be critical of Mr. Logue, actually, but I actually remember such a comment, actually. Not just by Mr. Logue, but others in the city. All right, so here's the takings plan. Here's the official urban renewal's taking plan. And look at how, 65 acres, 16 streets were closed for it. But look at how carefully, whoops. Oh, go back one. Go back one. Look at how carefully, right? How carefully, surgically, it avoided Faneuil Hall. Very, very, right? They didn't want the proponents for this didn't want to deal with that thing quite. And by the way, the proponents of the waterfront urban plan and the new preservationists in town managed in 1960 to finally designate this as a national historic landmark, which is amazing. Why it took so long. And by the way, 6 years later, it became on the National Register. But the so-called government-centered urban renewal plan was very, very, very precisely avoiding dealing with Faneuil Hall, much less, of course, the rest of the markets. So this was the sort of the third indignity to the markets. Not only were they severed from the waterfront by a couple of centuries of wharfing out, but then by the artery, but then by this gigantic hole for several years as the government-centered urban renewal plan sort of gained attention. By the way, you can see under construction in this view what became the JFK Federal Building, right? That's the taller part of it and the lower part of it. You can also see, by the way, in this image, what always fascinated me is, you see that line? That's actually the blue line and the green line, right? That was sort of exposed, right, at the time. So you can understand, actually, why it took so long to get to the markets. They were empty. They were dilapidating very rapidly. They had been dilapidating for a while, slowly, as they were being diminished in use. They were severed from the waterfront and the actual waterfront planning effort that was actually being very successful. And then they faced, of course, for a number of years, this giant, it looks, Boston, I'm sorry to say, Boston tended to look like a European city after World War II for a while. That's what's so stunning. Right? Dresden may have looked like this. Right? So I want to show you a couple of plans that you perhaps have not seen before. Because actually the imagining for the government center preceded the actual urban renewal designation. And the money actually didn't come until some years later. So here's a plan by Walter Gropius, dating to 1958. And look at it carefully. First of all, it kind of sort of left this somehow alone. The markets, because of course, people were advocating this to become a landmark at that time. The markets themselves were still black and out of sight, and awaiting the next urban renewal plan, perhaps. But look at the audacity of this. It goes all the way to the central artery. It actually obliterates the Blackstone block. Heaven forbid, right? An even sort of more amazing collection of modern buildings that stretch all the way, practically touch the State House, and then go all the way to the markets. But again, needing to leave Faneuil Hall there in the drawing because it was a landmark, but not saying very much about it at all. Right? Now, of course, we get into the early 1960s, and the need for a new city hall, which existed way back to the 1920s, the need for a city hall led to a very important, for architects, a very significant international design competition, which produced the city hall that we now know and love, at least us architects. And of the 8 finalists, I won't go through these, it's not very important, of the 8 finalists, of which, of course, our city hall emerged, only one of them actually drew a site plan which sort of incorporated the market as part of the idea. This was the second place finish, the second place awardee. And again, fairly significant for those who were at the time were trying to get it out of the grayness of these earlier renderings. This is the pre-government center urban design plan or urban renewal plan, which I wish the archives of the city would allow these 7 individuals to read in the next 24 hours, because it's completely forgotten, but actually was amazing. With drawings like this, before any design effort was taking place, right? This is 56. And with drawings like this that talked about a different future for the relationship between the government center and the waterfront and the neighborhoods all around it. So it was called Government Center Boston, and you can see, or you can't read, but an awful lot of sort of local architects, not brought from New York, local architects, and especially Kevin Lynch, who some of you might know, an eminent planner, professor, urban planning professor at MIT. And it was this document, actually, among those who were supportive of Government Center and the reuse of the markets, that actually was fairly instrumental, even though once the official urban renewal plan emerged, it was kind of forgotten, sort of thrown into the kind of waste paper basket, right? But by the way, go back to, never mind, go forward, right? So there, I just want to focus on this diagram, which actually was Kevin Lynch talked about a lot. He talked about a chain of open spaces. Gosh, who talked about such things in the 1960s? A vista to the sea, and also a walk to the sea, and other such things. Or you see the valley of lower buildings, right, which would create this sort of incorporating the new city hall, yet in the future, but to create a very different relationship between the two principal topographical features of the city, the hill and, well, the access to the rest of the world for a couple of centuries, the waterfront itself, right? And Kevin Lynch, as some of you know, of course, also produced around the same time, actually, it's still in print and doing very well, called The Image of the City. And so it actually was the work of this, go back one now, it's actually the work of this group, these folks, who began to see, yes, we need a government center and all of that, but we need to do something else. We need to think about that in relationship to the part of the city that connects us to the waterfront and indeed the rest of the world. Okay. And before you move forward, I show you this because this was a separate document printed by the John Hancock Corporation. It used the same image that appeared in that earlier plan. And by the way, this says, right, further evidence of the John Hancock's continued confidence in Boston's future. This was actually a big deal because here was that major corporate endeavor kind of saying, and this is why I showed you the tower, saying, yes, we will invest, even though the pressures actually is to do what came close to happening with the Prudential Center 10 years earlier, of moving it out into the suburban region somewhere. And so, again, there were sort of other players, not necessarily sort of that we remember so well, that began to champion for a different understanding about the public spaces of a city as opposed to the way we thought about them historically, especially with the area closest to the waterfront being, of course, the place for, yes, work, actually, in the way that the offices became a place for work. Well, a lot of these thoughts kind of remained thoughts for a long time. By the way, this one remained so for about 30 years. Actually, the actual walk to the sea, if any of you have sort of walked along it, didn't happen until 2008, right? And the irony, and by the way, shortly after 1976, actually the markets themselves, in conjunction with the city, were beginning to kind of offer, especially around the July 4th holiday, began to offer something called walks to the sea, but only for a couple of years. Ironically, by the time that an actual walk to the sea was realized, the markets were opposed to it going here, through the markets. They were doing very well, thank you. They didn't need some other little monuments and so forth. Isn't that funny, right? No, they were fine. They were fine, and so unfortunately, in some ways, not in others, right, the walk to the sea was then kind of moved over to kind of State Street, as opposed to the idea always being it would kind of go from the Capitol and then through City Hall Plaza and then, of course, through the markets on its way actually to the sea and Columbus Park and so forth. All right. Moving forward a little bit, not quite forward to the present, here's another document that I think has been forgotten, but really is unbelievably important, right? This is a centerfold. This is a center of a document paid for by the Boston Chamber of Commerce, a special New York Times supplement, 1965. So, again, think about that. That's still 11 years prior to the opening of the market. And this is the city saying, hey, Mr. Drucker, hey, all of your captains of industry, hey, look at what we're doing. Come back or come here, invest here. And so they're very proud about the demolition. They're very proud about, by that time, the City Hall was under construction, but the result of the renderings of the competition were there. There's a little bit less talk about Government Center, although you see Faneuil Hall appears, which is important. And then a rendering which does something else, which is forgotten, because we think of Government Center as, oh, this idea about creating a wonderful environment for the cradle of liberty and incorporating the 3 levels of government around a sort of monumental open space there. But what do you think this is? It's still there, by the way. It's 28 State Street. And so if we look closer at this document, and again, it would be something interesting for the panel of experts to read, it talks about new private office buildings. It talks about it will provide major new private office development, because that's what cities needed at the time. Nothing perhaps better symbolizes Boston's resurgence than what we are doing in order to reinvent ourselves relative to what seems so necessary, which is private investment, which had been missing in Boston largely for the prior several decades. So that's a kind of a stunning thing, right? In fact, it shows one of these towers. And if we go forward a little bit, actually, right? During the 1960s, when historians now talk about, well, government center, city hall, blah, 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 great space, actually, an awful lot of investment was taking place around these sort of gigantic towers for people. And if you look at the date, these are the dates, by the way, of the construction period. You'd have to go several years earlier about the investment collection and interest and so forth. Look at them. They all more or less respond, a little bit later, more or less respond to the timing around the completion of the government center. And this little cluster of tall buildings, some of which are no longer quite as needed as they were the expected results of the government center urban renewal plan. And in fact, so that centerfold, as I called it, worked in a way, right? It worked. It was preparing the city to modernize itself, not just, of course, with the design of the government center, but to prepare itself to prepare for the next important kind of urban economy, which is sort of office work, right? And people forget that these things, and you recognize all of them, I'm sure these things were the product of the urban renewal period, which, although originally supposed to build lots of housing, actually wound up building lots of private office buildings. But indeed, it supported the renewal of the city economically and in terms of bodies. Most of the bodies in these buildings probably were not living in Boston, but there are a heck of a lot more bodies now introduced to the downtown area, right? I mean, millions of square, each of these buildings is millions of square feet, right? One or two at least. So, I don't think many people realize that these towers were, in a way, the result of the urban renewal period, which, of course, there are many more reasons to talk about how it was negative especially for those who were displaced, as opposed to for those who began to kind of bring the city back into the sort of end of the 20th century, if you will. Okay. I'm almost done. I don't know why I was given 45 minutes, but I can keep talking if you would like. Happy to. I first arrived, like Professor Wu, I first arrived in search of, in my case, a graduate school in 1974. And of course, I came here to look at the City Hall, of course, the greatest example of contemporary architecture for an architecture student at the time. And this is just a random image. I just took a picture of City Hall Plaza a couple of years after it was opened, which was 69, 70 or so. Right? And look at this image of City Hall Plaza. Now, the fountain was, whoops, I'm pointing this thing at myself. The fountain was marvelous and a great attractor. Look at these. These were the kind of the antecedents of food trucks all along the street, right? And then this was at midday, midweek. This was nothing special, right? Pretty good. For the first several years of the opening of the plaza, before we start to hate it and try to improve it every couple of years for the last 50 years, this was the place to go in this part of town. 2 years later, most people just walk down the stairs across Congress Street to, of course, the next new, major attraction. So here's another issue related to prosperity. It also has some challenges associated with it. Not least, although rarely talked about very much, is that the new takes precedence over the existing. And sometimes, instead of expanding on the old to make a better new, we have feet. And sometimes we go to the next novelty. And that's another reason, I think, apart all of the reasons that you should all learn about why the markets have sort of been failing of late. Partially, they're no longer new. They're no longer new. Next, please. So, as was mentioned, and I think it tends to be kind of overlooked, with prosperity comes new opportunities. With prosperity comes an enlargement of what we consider the public realm. With prosperity, new venues for not so much always living first, but fun for sure, and markets and so forth. By the kind of late 80s, of course, Newbury Street actually was somehow miraculously saved by the malls, right? People thought the malls would kill Newbury Street. The opposite kind of almost happens, right? Newbury Street was revived as a major commercial and a fun corridor, not even commercial, just a fun corridor. And likewise, in more recent years, of course, as was mentioned earlier, so has the Seaport Innovation District. So that's one of the things that is very kind of important to keep in mind. And this is why Ed gave you 3 reasons for cities, and I'm going to give you these 3, right? One has to, at the same time, those who are governing the city, those who are planning the city, those who wish to kind of be part of the city, have to kind of simultaneously deal with preserving a worthy past. They certainly have to deal with, on a daily basis, with the challenges of the present, as well as they begin to dream about how to prepare itself for a better future. That's a very difficult threesome to consider. And occasionally one takes precedence over the others, and rarely turns out as well as if those things are somehow able to be kind of balanced in time. Thank you.
So, excuse me, can I invite Professor Landsmark, Alex, and the mayor, because so far we've covered the economics of the marketplace, and then Professor Krieger just touched on the physical, the design part. I'd like to spend the next segment to talk a little bit about the social part. So, Ted, you had just arrived in Boston from New York, not for many years, right around 1976. And the mayor already alluded to at the time that it was actually a time of social strife in the city. And with busing, still the lingering discussions around civil rights and the Vietnam War. Now, you've heard several times today that the market was an instant success and it seemed to appeal to almost everybody. But is that really true? And can you talk a little bit about sort of the kind of significance that the market had culturally and socially? What it meant for people, and was it actually true that it felt like a common ground for everyone?
I'd only been here a couple of years, 2-3 years, and the market at the time was where we went for fun. There weren't that many other places in town where, particularly if you were fairly recently arrived, you could go and hang out without necessarily being in one of the neighborhoods that you might not know. I certainly heard a lot about how much fun I could have if I went to bars in Southie. And my response to that was, I don't think so. And there weren't that many other neighborhoods in the city where you could go, meet new people, interact with people different than yourselves, meet people who had come into town from Revere and Quincy to hang out. And so the marketplace was, it really was kind of a common ground, a gathering spot, because of the restaurants and because of the physical layout of the place. If you found yourself getting into trouble in a bar, you could just step outside and get some air. Or you could walk the 2 blocks down to the waterfront. And so it was a place where a certain demographic of young people felt very comfortable hanging out. And in many respects, it worked the way the waterfront does now, where people go and feel comfortable just walking around, window shopping, and what have you. And it wasn't as pristine as Newbury Street was. It was almost as funky as parts of Allston Brighton, and almost as funky as parts of Boylston Street, particularly up by the poorhouse and the like. And then the sense was that it kind of became dominated by tourists. And it stopped being a place where you would say to folks, let's go to X to hang out on a Thursday or Friday night, with the exception of a couple of places like the Black Rose. And it lost its cachet as something that was really owned by young people in the city. And I would just say one other thing to the panel. As I was thinking about this through the morning. I wonder what the...
I'm getting a note. Let me check.
Yep. Okay. Whoop. Hello. I wonder how one converts a civic space into a public space. Because the thing that strikes me about Faneuil Hall and the area around it is that I feel as though it's largely perceived to be a civic space. It has a certain formality because it's where you go to pay your tickets or to get your birth certificate or your marriage license or to settle a matter in a courthouse. Where a public space is where you go to hang out. And I wonder, and one does not have fun in civic spaces. There's virtually no way to have fun in a civic space because it's where you go to hold yourself accountable. But in a public space, you go and you can act out and you can dress funny and you can make weird noises and you can complain about, the people next to you. And at this moment, at least, the sense I have about Faneuil Hall and the district that surrounds it is that for Bostonians, it's not really thought of as a public space where one goes to have fun. And so I would hope that the panel would think about what would make the area attractive as a public space where one went to have fun.
Talk a little bit about sort of in this public versus civic. Think about sort of ownership, because one of the things that the mayor's already alluded to is about public control and perhaps ownership. So in terms of like being so welcoming, that is it dependent, I think, on in your opinion, on ownership and control?
Well, the thing that has occurred to me this morning is that it's not so much the ownership and control, the external, that matters. To me, what matters is the spirit and the innate cachet that the place has, that derives from its identity as a particular kind of place. The public garden is a particular kind of place without one's thinking about who owns or controls it. The same for the emerald necklace. No one here can tell me who owns and controls the emerald necklace. And yet people go there and have a wonderful time. So I don't think it's about ownership or control as much as it is about the innate spirit that the place has. And I think that innate spirit derives in part from the history of the place and the events that take place there, but also from the kinds of people who hang out there.
But the spirit that you talked about was, it attracted all kinds of people who lived in downtown or, North End, Beacon Hill, but also
rich,
suburbanites.
Poor, old, young. You didn't know who you were going to run into when you went into the Salty Dog. The place early on transcended class in a lot of respects until a number of small class-focused businesses moved in and kind of drove out local people who just wanted to go there for a beer or to pick up some fast food. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I think about the area as a district from the Garden down through, I would say, Emerson. It's a big district, but in fact a fairly small area. And it's full of cultural and historical artifacts and events that could brand the area in a particular way that speaks to the city's sense of social justice. There's statues of both Red Auerbach and Bill Russell. It's got some of the best transportation anywhere. It's got the Crispus Attucks plaque. It's got the courthouses. And if we wanted to say that it was it's got this building. If we wanted to say that it was the heart of Boston's commitment to social justice over 250 years, then in fact you could look at the district with Faneuil Hall at the center of it, who has spoken here, what have you, and you could say, this is a brand that someone could do something with. This is the area where people come to visit. And yet, City Hall Plaza in particular almost has no identity. So it's an artifact or a product that is more than 2 centuries old that's still looking for a brand. And I think one of the things that the panel could think about is what that brand would be in a way that would make it a destination and not just a place where virtually all of the city's subway lines pass under.
So what you're talking about is something intrinsic to the place, the history, and culture of the city. And now, Mayor, you've already spoke of your first visit. Both you and I were outsiders arriving in Boston. I came in 1987, just as the market's popularity peaked. And I remember being completely sort of bowled over. And, you described eating clam chowder out of a bread bowl. I could never dare go for that because it was so big. Now, you were charmed. Now that you're part of the city and very much part of our fabric, how do you think of that experience in the context of what the market has become? And, Ted just talked about these elements which are really authentic to this place, the city. Do you think that the marketplace itself, not the buildings themselves, but what happens here is authentic to the city?
Well, as I was listening to Dr. Landsmark's words, I was trying to reflect on if we could tease apart. There seemed to be two kind of, in my mind, chicken and egg, where's the starting point, bits to sort out. One is this idea that locals don't come anymore and don't feel a need to come. And is that the sort of the Yogi Bear, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded, right? That there's no, it's not for you, right? It's for this other group of people. It's catering to tourists or those who might not be familiar with the historic sites and need to see them one time through. And do those tourists even come back once they've sort of experienced that one time? So who is it for, and do you belong to the group that a place feels like it is for? And then there's what value do you get from going there? Is it providing some service or some thing that you whether it's a particular store with for kids, or whether it's a bar that is the go-to hangout place. And these two are definitely interconnected. But thinking through what we can do now in this moment to sort of arrive at the right balance of both of those questions, I think is very much the insights of this group and our community can inform us. And then the second sort of conundrum I was thinking through comes from a bit of what both Professor Glaser and Professor Krieger have said is, how do you make something feel new and exciting continuously? Not just when it first opens, not just until the next big thing comes along. And especially these days when you can open up whatever your app of choice is and see what that one street that everyone has to go take a picture in front of, or that one event now that's happening. It has to be a mix probably of the special and the unique that we're creating an experience, right? City Hall Plaza, with the new renovations for accessibility and the mark that we have put on this sort of ever evolving bit of the plaza. It has now created the infrastructure where we can host the I forget what it was called, but the snowboarding event where tons of snow were dumped on the plaza, and we had the world's premier snowboarders and others, and that drew a lot of interest for all the local businesses in the area that also benefited from that foot traffic, and that was a one weekend. And there's these chances to create that feeling that even if you don't know, even it's not the store that you're always going to need to go to that's fixed there, it's always the place where you can see something new and interesting, which requires a lot of programming and a lot of additional work on top of it as well. But this underlying idea of brand identity, and then how does that feel relevant and still important in today's world? Interestingly, as we're going through this cycle of renewing our commitment to history now at the 250th, we saw some of the images of the bicentennial. Every look backwards is always a look forward if we do it right. And this moment particularly, there are a lot of questions about where we go from here as a country, given what we're seeing from other levels of government, given what we're seeing and experiencing and feeling within all of our communities. And how do we seize on this particularly relevant need right now for the brand of what does America truly stand for? Who do we truly stand for? Boston has a lot to offer in that conversation. We always have, but especially now, and I believe leading up to our 400th anniversary, there is a world of possibility for the sense of place also to connect to that larger sense of belonging and values and identity.
This notion of brand, I think, Alex, your slide talking about at that time was the new Boston, of which, this marketplace was very much part of that branding. How about, Mayor, this notion of, you're essentially talking about program and curating it. But there's also something unique about this marketplace, which blended commercial success and cultural sort of welcoming, all seem seamless. Now, do you think that that's, because we're constantly, you know now that we're constantly looking for revenues to support the kind of public uses and civic uses that we need. But the unique thing about this marketplace for so long was that it was able to generate revenues for the operators as well as, throwing off this sort of secondary and tertiary impact. Do you think commercialism, when you first came, did you feel like you were being sort of conned into buying clam chowder that was priced too high?
As a college, soon-to-be college student, I probably wasn't even paying too much attention at that point. It was even the idea of, and this is just separate, but growing up in an immigrant family, even the idea of being able to have clam chowder and so many different choices in front of me, rather than just eating Chinese food at home. And when in the rare instances we would eat out, we would go to a Chinese buffet as well. So, just the sense of what this meant as a portal to the rest of the world here in our neighborhoods, getting to go to Chinatown and the proximity to here, getting to experience some of the history across the river as well, and the many, many different languages that you hear on the streets. That feeling of all of a sudden being open to the world was a snapshot of, from me growing up in the environment that I did. That was life-changing for me. And I think we're in this moment where we need both a sense of belonging and an affirmation and promise that everybody's core identities and all the facets of themselves are protected and safe here in Boston. But the real power of our city is that we feel so much pride for our city through that sense of connection to our own identities, that we also know how much it means for all of our neighbors to have that same connection to pride and identity. And I believe the moment you actually become a Bostonian, you might not be lucky enough to be born here, but the moment you become a Bostonian is that moment where you're ready to fight someone who's insulting some aspect of your city, right? And it doesn't have to be your own particular slice of the culture or your own neighborhood or the sports team that you cheer for the most, but there is this sense that we know what it means to be fiercely proud of who we are, in a way that we also want to create the spaces for all of our neighbors and community members to be proud of exactly who they are, even if that's not the same as us.
You touch on the point that I think actually Ted already touched on, which is that this was a common ground, but I think we, at least from the people who have spoken to about the market, almost all Bostonians right around the bicentennial felt pride for the marketplace because it was representative. Maybe, do you feel that way, or do your family now feel that way? Ted, do you feel that way, that there's a sense of pride that, hey, Quincy Market, Faneuil Hall Marketplace is someplace that we're proud to show people who want to know a little bit about Boston? And is that elusive?
Yeah, I absolutely feel that way. I know that when the financial markets were initially asked locally to support the redevelopment of the marketplace, most of the local financial people walked away from it. because they didn't think that it would generate enough revenue. And the financing came in from outside of town.
Chase from Manhattan and Mayor White actually had to send Ira Jackson to twist their arms to finance this thing.
Yeah, you know, and Tad Stahl and the architects who were working on it were sort of verklempt about the whole process of having come up with this wonderful idea that was going to generate a lot of revenue and not having the support of the financial community to make it happen. And my recollection is that it started making money from as soon as it opened. You know, it just conservative judgments on the part of the credit markets locally. But I certainly feel tremendous pride in what was accomplished with it. You know, you go back to when the Cambridge 7 Where's Boston was located there, and it was a destination for a lot of folks coming in from out of town. If you wanted to give them a sense of not just Boston's history, but its presence and the nature of the neighborhoods and why it is that if you came into town, you should get out into the neighborhoods to see the rest of the city. So I think that sense of pride can be regenerated. And I also think that unlike some other potential destinations, it can bring together people from outside of the region. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of college students who come into the area. They want to have fun on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, but from what I can tell, they're much more inclined to go to the seaport than to come into downtown. And the activities that one would engage in are the same in both areas, but one area has a cachet of being fun, and the other area has the cachet of being where you go to pay your parking tickets.
So, Mayor, for your children, do they come here?
Yeah, I would make an extra note on the renovations that were done on City Hall Plaza that I've forgot to note. One of the most exciting was that there was also a playground installed. It's right across from the Boston Public Market. We also then reopened a long closed-off entrance and exit into entrance, now it used to only be exit, on the north side of the building that has now facilitated people being able to walk through the building all the way as well. And, you know, it's always full, no matter what time of day I'm there, no matter what the temperature is. There are always families on that playground. And it certainly, I think, hasn't hurt that wonderful slide has gotten some national recognition on social media over the last several years. But it's an example of people also needing just a place to be. Right, so I think these days when you can have every option available to you, you have your sort of comfort routine, right? The places that you go that make you feel like make you feel like who you are, right? Whether that's your favorite coffee shop or the place in your neighborhood that you always meet your friends at or take your family to for dinner or whatever it is. Then there's the places that are something exciting and new, a special event that's happening, or a trip to one of our institutions like the museums, or et cetera. And then there's the places that you just go to be, right? A playground where the kids can run around. Maybe they even know all the features very well, but you know everyone's safe there. They have a good time. Everyone can kind of just take a breath and just exist in that moment and not have to, be taking in something new and on high alert. We're trying to break down the silos between all of those experiences as a city, I think, as well, right? To take our museums and special incredible experience places and make them more of the places that you just go to be because they're yours, because you can access them for free now as a Boston kid growing up in our city, and you can make memories that then connect them to being a core part of your childhood. And so I think the possibility is there in this area. The Seaport has more of the you can go, I think you can throw axes there at the wall, and you can play golf virtually with VR things, and there's all sorts of new, exciting sort of amenities that are the cutting edge of technology and play and commercialism all together there as the sort of fun draw. And we need spaces that are where people just feel like it belongs to them, and I think there's a lot of potential for that to be this space in the city.
And I think for me, your comment on making memories really resonates. You go back to a place frequently if you have the feeling that it's a place that's going to continue to make positive memories for you. And you don't return to a place where the sense is it's one and done, and there's no real reason to go back. There's no archival sense of your identification with that place.
Yeah. Alex, one of the drawings that struck me most was the sort of the footprints of the new buildings. And so we go back to the notion of live, work, play, right? So the West End, the live version, and again, the map that showed all of the towers, standing in, compared to the old fabric, that was imported from some, Corbusier were popularizing this as an international style. City Hall itself is also international style, imported from another place. They were like spaceships actually landed in our city. Now, the marketplace, of course, was, I don't think any of us could talk about the style of architecture per se. It's really centered around the human experience, right? Like, how do people move through these spaces? How important is that? And because in a way, we're talking about brand, we're talking about memory and meaning. There's something about Boston, right? It's the DNA, so there's a physical dimension. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and how important is it for us to sort of rekindle that? Because you've already made up this challenge of it's not new, and how do you make it still relevant?
So can I answer that question in a minute or two? It is? Yeah, it is. I'll answer that in 2 minutes or so, because I want to get back to one of the issues. Sure. So, by the way, Ted made a great sort of distinction between civic spaces and public spaces. But I will tell you that's a kind of a weird American idea. I mean, with the exception of, the Bernini's improvement to the public space in front of the Vatican, most plazas in Rome, and think about the architects for City Hall. They said they were creating the equivalent of the Siena, which, by the way, has a City Hall there. What they forgot was that it had a perimeter that had lots of doors. And we have, a couple of metal detectors in front of the Kennedy building and so forth, right? So it's actually, I think that I have one solution for, by the way, I worked on the 5th floor of the South Building for 3 years for an architecture firm when I was very young, so I saw this place every day. Right? My own idea about why it started to fail, other than being no longer new and all of a sudden Newbury Street was cooler and so forth, was that initially it seemed to be both about history and consumption. At some point, it actually began to be about consumption. And at some point, you didn't, I can't remember the last time I bought something there, other than maybe a cup of coffee or something, right? Even when I was working there, right? But it began to fail, and I can't identify it to a year or a month or a particular owner or whatever. At some point, the fact that it was just selling you stuff overwhelmed the initial, I think, reason for its popularity. Yes, it was about buying stuff, but it was about actually experiencing history, experience a city for all those suburbanites who had forgotten but decided that was pretty cool. So the future of the marketplace, I think, has to become a public space, but also it has the potential of becoming a civic space. Because really, the 4 centuries of Boston's history could be embedded in this section of town, right? And so again, I think that what happened, and was not to somebody's kind of immediate observation or kind of knowledge, but all of a sudden you start to walk in there and all you were aware of was just stuff to buy as opposed to stuff to experience. And so the ability to kind of connect, like most plazas in ancient European cities, they're both public and civic. So by the way, so if James Rouse, bless him, who was a suburban developer before he decided that cities were fun, if he had arrived 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, and to be in charge of City Hall Plaza, he would edge it with shops and nonprofits maybe, or other things, right? So the failure, I think, of this era and the failure of our misunderstanding of cities is that there had to be these distinctions between civic and public and so forth, as opposed to the best urban places are where many can find their own reason for being there, rather than be pursued voraciously. By the way, some of those, not so much on the inside, but some of those vendors, they would accost you. They would frankly accost you, right? At some point, maybe not in 1976, but later on. So I think that was the beginning of the failure of it, apart from the fact that it was no longer new and so forth, which is that it stopped being a place where you experienced Boston and Boston's history, and you were assaulted by people selling you stuff that you didn't really need.
No,
one more thing. So just one more thing about this, because maybe I've already said it. I do think that the ability to understand a place for what it was is as important as for what it is at the moment or for what it might be. And that's my little trilogy of why governance needs to think about those 3 things simultaneously. And so the future of this area, including this building and the market, has to be more about understanding Boston, in addition to providing shops or whatever else still might need to support that. But we lost that connection to the marketplace being about Boston as it became more of a shopping center, which of course there are all kinds of alternatives all around Boston.
Yeah, the experience matters. Whatever happens to the marketplace, it's probably not going to replace Amazon and eBay anytime soon. So the question is, what is the experience you want the visitor, and I, from my perspective, the resident of this area, to want to go back to again and again, to really love. And then you have to think about what are any experiences that we want to go back to and really love. And I think that the answer to that is part of the key of sustaining that space into the future.
I don't know if I answered your first question.
Well, I think that actually you touched on it without actually making comment. I know we're close to time, and Mayor, you need to head somewhere else. And you talked about sort of the pride that we have as a city, and the home teams that we root for. I think we have a team here that I think before we go, I'd love for you to just sort of like, I think for Philip and Jason, the notion that sports team, even though they're privately owned, all of us have really strong opinions about how it should be run. So this should not be intimidating for you. So Mayor, for a few minutes, charge our advisors and sort of what are some of the things that you really want us to dig into with them so that we can reclaim some of this, Bostonness in this marketplace?
Well, thank you again for the time and the faith that you have in our city to even engage now and in the many ways that you all already have. I would say there's probably two pieces for me. Of one, we are so used to starting from understanding what the constraints are in government. And we have to, especially today, resource constraints, legal ownership constraints, authorities of this party versus that party, et cetera, constraints about what is possible economically given sort of the trends of the day. And if there were ever a space where I would love us to just set aside the constraints of this moment and even this era and dream big, think about the legacy that we have and where we need to go. That's the first piece. That is why we're having this larger conversation with our community, that really want to understand what are we trying to get to, and then we can figure out the very difficult pieces of how we maneuver what we need to arrive at that point. And then the second piece is there are probably many studies and many, all of your expertise about how to make any space economically viable or vibrant, right? There are best practices about the desire lines for walking or pathways or this or that or the other or et cetera. We don't want this place to be just successful as any other place could be. We don't want it just to feel like it's exciting. It needs to feel and exude Boston. Some of the challenge of that is trying to bottle up exactly what we mean by Boston in a way that it's also not static, and that can also evolve and respond and reflect the needs and the ethos of each generation that's going to follow afterwards. But I think this is a particularly important and pressurized inflection point for all of us to be talking about the trajectory of our country, and this in some ways is a little microcosm of that sense of hope and faith that we can make that turn, and what we do here will be a larger signal for what we need to do everywhere else as well. But most of all, I want to hear Dr. Landsmark's answer on this question. What should we charge as the next steps?
What she said. This struck me as I was sitting here today. This downtown area, as much as any historicized place in the country, speaks to values that we have purported to hold in very high esteem for a long time. The area, the circumference of 3/4 of a mile around here, speaks to all of the values that America is supposed to feel are best. And, whether it's the Celtics or this building or the State House or a range of other things. And this immediate area is the center of all of that, and ought to project, as you've said, a set of values that are about equity and fairness and justice. That's why people come to Boston. Our waterfront is great, but they come here to see the expression of those positive values. And in the process of redoing, remaking, repositioning this area, I think that should be at the core. That's why people come here. And I think the way we configure our buildings and spaces ought to project that. And that ought to be a key element of the rebranding of what that building should be.
Which is why it should be both a civic space and a public space.
So I want to thank Mayor, Ted, Alex, for all of you joining us this morning to give us the kind of context for our work for the next day and a half. And some of you will, and I just want to thank you so that you can get on with your day. And then I will just, before we close, come back to tell you a little bit about the rest of the day. Thank you, Mayor. So for those of you, just to give you a sense of where we go from here, thank you for the public who have been part of this morning's program. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a beginning of a 2-day study with the advisors that we've brought from other parts of the world. And we will be doing some work internally to think of ideas with 2 very specific charges. One is that begin to have us ask the right questions about how we can create a more coherent plan to address some of the challenges that downtown faces. And then more specifically to deal with working with our partners, with JSRE, in how this particular marketplace can be a larger catalyst for the greater area that I think we've touched on this morning. Now, after these 2 days, the advisors will be returning again. And in the meantime, we are going to get their guidance in doing the work ourselves within the planning department and hope to reconvene so that we can actually share with you the work that we will be doing in the next few months. So thank you for coming today. Some of you will be joining us later this evening for another public event. And I hope that this morning is a energizing, challenging, but inspiring for all of you to think that we can actually have a path forward for the next 50 years. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you.